Prologue. Seringapatam, India, 1799. I am writing to you, the family, from India to explain why I am no longer friendly with my cousin, John Herncastle. Herncastle and I were here with the British Army. We were staying near the palace of Seringapatam in southern India. There were many mysterious stories about the palace. One of the wildest stories was about a yellow diamond. It was once part of a statue of the moon god, and it was guarded day and night by 3 Indian priests. But 100 years ago, the diamond, called the moonstone, was stolen and brought to the palace of Seringapatam. People said that 3 priests were secretly still guarding the moonstone at the palace. Herncastle was one of the few men in the army who thought that the moonstone story was true. On the 4th of May, 1799, the British Army attacked the palace. On the night of the attack, I found Herncastle in one of the palace rooms with a bloody knife in his hand. Lying across the entrance of the room, there were the dead bodies of 2 Indians, and in front of him, another Indian was falling to the floor. As the Indian lay dying, he looked at Herncastle and said,
"The moonstone will have its revenge on you and yours."
At that moment, the room filled with more men. The fighting went on, and I didn't see my cousin until the next morning. "Tell me," I said, "how did the Indian die, and what did his last words mean?"
"I know no more than you do,"
said Herncastle. I turned my back on him, and we have not spoken since. Please understand that I am writing about my cousin in order to warn you. I did not see him kill the men with my own eyes, but I am quite sure that he did kill them. Not only this, but I am also sure that he stole the moonstone. The moonstone will have its revenge on Herncastle and any other person to whom he gives the diamond. Indian Diamond in Yorkshire. On the 24th of May, 1848, Lady Verinder called her old servant, Gabriel Betteridge, into the sitting room of her family home in Yorkshire.
"Gabriel," she said, "here is news that will surprise you. Franklin Blake has come back from abroad. He is coming tomorrow to stay until next month, and will be here for Rachel's birthday. You must get a room ready for him."
Franklin Blake was Lady Verinder's nephew, her eldest sister's only son. He had lived with his aunt and his cousin Rachel Verinder in Yorkshire as a boy, until he went to school in Germany. This was Franklin's first visit back, and everyone was excited about seeing him again. The next morning, Lady Verinder and Miss Rachel drove out to lunch with some friends, because Franklin had told them he wasn't arriving until dinner time. Betteridge was getting the room ready for Franklin when he heard a noise in the garden. He went outside and saw 3 dark-skinned Indians looking at the house. With them was a small, fair English boy. They wanted to see the lady of the house, but left politely when they were told that she was out. Shortly afterwards, Betteridge's daughter, Penelope, came in a hurry to see her father. She also worked at Lady Verinder's house as Rachel's servant.
"Father!"
she cried.
"Where are those Indians? They want to do something wicked, I'm sure.
Penelope had followed the Indians when they entered the garden. One Indian made the small boy hold out his hand. He put some black ink on it and asked,
"Will the English gentleman travel to this house this evening? Has the English gentleman got it with him?"
The boy's answer to both questions had been,
Yes.
Betteridge promised his daughter to ask Franklin Blake what the "it" in the conversation was. Then he went to fetch the housemaid, Rosanna Spearman, for lunch. Rosanna was quiet and hard-working, and Betteridge liked her. He also knew her secret. Rosanna had been a thief, and she had been to prison. But Lady Verinda had felt sorry for her and had given her a job as a housemaid, so Rosanna didn't need to steal in order to get money anymore. Betteridge followed Rosanna's favourite walk to a lonely beach not far from the house. The place was known as the Shivering Sand, because the moving sands there were dangerous when the sea was low. When Betteridge reached the beach, he saw Rosanna in her big grey coat. She was crying.
"Come and sit down,"
he said kindly,
"and tell me why you always come to this miserable place."
I try to keep away, but I can't.
she said in a low voice. Suddenly, there was a shout from behind them.
"Betteridge, where are you?"
Rosanna looked around.
Oh, who is it?
She asked softly. A bright-eyed young gentleman came up to them. He was not a tall man, but he was very good-looking. He had brown hair and a beard, and he wore fashionable foreign clothes. He came and sat down on the sand next to the old man. It was Franklin Blake, and he was 4 hours early.
"Welcome back, Mr. Franklin,"
the old servant said. Betteridge was pleasantly surprised to see the man whom he had last seen as a boy. But Rosanna Spearman's face turned deep red. She seemed suddenly uncomfortable, and she ran back to the house.
"You have arrived early,"
continued Betteridge.
"I have a reason for that,"
The young man answered.
"I wanted to lose a dark stranger who has been following me."
Betteridge told Franklin about the visit by the 3 Indians. He was surprised by Franklin's reply.
"Has the English gentleman got it with him? I suppose that it means this,"
he said, and he pulled something out of his pocket.
"My uncle's famous Indian diamond."
"Oh, sir, why do you have your wicked uncle's diamond with you?"
asked Betteridge.
"My uncle has left his diamond as a birthday present to his niece, my cousin Rachel," said Franklin. "And my father asked me to bring it here. But, Betteridge, why do you call my uncle wicked? What do you know about him?"
Lady Verinda's brother, John Herncastle, was in India with the army and returned to England with a large diamond. From the moment of his return, all his family refused to see him, and no one ever knew the true story of how he had got his diamond. Your uncle never tried to sell the jewel, and he never showed it to anyone. Twice in India he nearly died, and he thought that the moonstone held a terrible secret.
Betteridge told Franklin all this as they sat near the Shivering Sand. He also spoke of a visit from Herncastle 2 years before, on Rachel's birthday. At that time, Lady Verinda had refused to let her brother into the house.
"I shall remember my niece's birthday."
Herncastle laughed wickedly, and he left. Franklin listened with greater and greater interest to Betteridge's story.
Now let me tell you what I know,
Franklin said.
My father's business with the Herncastle diamond is a strange story. My uncle gave my father some important papers, and in return, my father put the jewel in his bank and told his lawyer, Mr. Bruff, that he would get a note from Herncastle once a year. If Bruff didn't get a note on an agreed date, it was because someone had murdered Herncastle. Bruff then had orders to read a letter which was left with the diamond. After my uncle died in his sleep 6 months ago, Bruff opened the letter. It told him to take the moonstone secretly to Amsterdam and have it cut into 4 to 6 stones. I think my uncle's life had been in danger from people who were looking for the moonstone. And he thought he could stop the danger if the diamond were no longer a single stone. But then, in his will, my uncle left the moonstone as a birthday present to his niece, but only if her mother, Lady Verinder, was still alive. Why? For me, the important question is, does the terrible secret of the moonstone continue after Herncastle dies?
Did Herncastle say why he left the diamond to Miss Rachel?
Betteridge asked.
Oh, yes,
replied Franklin.
His will says that it is to show that he forgives Lady Verinder. But remember that Lady Verinder refused to see her brother for years. I don't know what to do for the best,
said Franklin.
What do you think, Betteridge?
Betteridge's idea was to put the diamond into a bank at Frizinghall, the nearest town. It was a month until Miss Rachel's birthday, and in this way they could wait and see what happened.
A wonderful idea,
Franklin said, and he jumped up.
Get the best horse ready for me. I shall take the diamond to Frizinghall before the ladies come back.
Chapter 2. The diamond disappears. Betteridge and Franklin hurried back to the house and found a good horse to take Franklin to Frizinghall. He rode away at once to take the moonstone to the bank there. When Lady Verinder and Miss Rachel came back later that afternoon, they were surprised to hear that their guest had arrived early and then left for Frizinghall. Being careful not to say anything about the diamond, Betteridge explained that Franklin had suddenly changed his plans. Just then, Betteridge's daughter, Penelope, came to talk to him.
Father,
she said,
since Rosanna Spearman returned from the Shivering Sand, she has been behaving very strangely. Has she ever met Mr. Blake before?
No, never,
replied Betteridge.
Then I think,
said Penelope,
that Rosanna has fallen in love with Franklin Blake.
Betteridge laughed loudly. How could a poor housemaid like Rosanna fall in love with a gentleman like Franklin? But Penelope wasn't laughing.
Father, you're wicked to make fun of Rosanna,
she said angrily, and left the room. When the diamond was safely in the bank, Franklin returned from Frizinghall. The ladies were pleased to have him with them that evening. Rachel took special care to get ready for dinner, and after dinner she sang with Franklin while Lady Verinder played the piano. At the end of the evening, Betteridge brought Franklin some brandy and water to his room. He could see that Franklin was no longer worried about the diamond.
Miss Rachel is the most charming girl that I have seen since I came back to England,
said Franklin dreamily. There was still nearly a month until Rachel's birthday party. To pass the time, Franklin gave Rachel the idea of painting the door into her sitting room, the room next to her bedroom. Franklin and Rachel started painting flowers, birds, and small animals around the door. While the two of them were busy painting every day, the servants were busy talking about them. Everyone could see that Franklin was in love with Rachel. He had even stopped smoking to please her. But what did Rachel feel for him? Rachel was indeed a charming young woman. She was small and very pretty, with black hair, dark eyes, and the most beautiful smile. But Rachel was different from most of the young women of her age, because she was strong and determined. She was able to decide things for herself, and did not need to ask other people what to do. She was also very honest, and had never told a lie in her life. But it was impossible to find out who Rachel loved. Rachel did not tell her secrets to anyone, not even her mother. Another guest who was coming to the party was Rachel's cousin, Godfrey Ablewhite. He was a tall, fine-looking man with long, fair hair. He worked in London as a lawyer, but was also well known for his charity work, which helped poor women. He was a good speaker at meetings, and people were happy to give him lots of money for charity. In fact, Godfrey was popular with everyone. Rachel had a photograph of him beside her bed. A few days before the party, the housemaid, Rosanna Spearman, was behaving very strangely and looked ill. Lady Verinder told Betteridge to send her away for a rest. But Rosanna cried and refused to leave. Finally, Lady Verinder agreed with Betteridge that it was better to let Rosanna stay on at the house. It was the 21st of June, the day of Rachel's 18th birthday. After he had painted the door all morning with Rachel, Franklin rode off to Frizinghall to fetch the moonstone. He returned with Godfrey Ablewhite and his two sisters, who had also been invited to the party. They were talking excitedly as they entered the house.
"Have you got the diamond safe?"
Betteridge asked Franklin quietly.
Yes, it's here in my pocket,
replied Franklin.
"Did you see any Indians?"
continued Betteridge.
No,
said Franklin calmly, and he walked across the hall to look for Rachel. Half an hour later, there were loud cries of excitement from the library. In the middle of the room sat Rachel, with Colonel Herncastle's diamond in her hand. Franklin had just given it to her, and Godfrey and his sisters were staring at it.
Oh, how wonderful!
The sisters cried.
Beautiful, beautiful,
said Godfrey softly. The diamond was the size of a small bird's egg. A beautiful yellow light shone from the centre of the jewel, like bright sunlight. Lady Verinder was standing by the window, with her back to the others. Why had her brother left this gift for Rachel? Had he forgiven Lady Verinder, or was he looking for revenge? That afternoon, Rachel and Godfrey took a walk in the garden. They had not seen each other for some time, and they walked arm in arm, laughing. But when they returned to the house, half an hour later, they walked separately, and they were not laughing. Godfrey had asked Rachel to marry him, but Rachel had refused. She had explained to him that she was in love with another man. Later that evening, Rachel wore the diamond at the dinner party. As the guests came in, they looked at Rachel and her diamond with great excitement and interest. The fact that Rachel had chosen to wear the diamond at the party only made Lady Verinder more worried. When all the guests had arrived, they took their places at the dinner table. The guest on Rachel's left was Dr. Candy, the doctor at Frizinghall.
I would like to do an experiment on your diamond, Rachel,
said Dr. Candy.
If I burn your diamond, it may disappear, And you won't need to worry about keeping it safe.
He laughed. But the guest who was sitting on Rachel's right was much more serious. Mr. Murthwaite was a tall, thin, quiet man. He had travelled all over India for many years, and he knew everything about the country and its people. He did not speak much during the party, but when he did speak, it was to say something about the diamond.
Be very careful, Miss Rachel,
he said.
If you ever go to India, don't wear that diamond. In a certain Indian city, if the priests see you with the moonstone, they will kill you.
Oh, how interesting,
cried Rachel and the Ablewhite sisters. But the conversation at the table did not go well. Dr. Candy and Franklin started arguing about medicine. Although Franklin had been sleeping badly, he refused to take any medicine. He told Dr. Candy that all medicines and the doctors who gave them were useless. Franklin spoke loudly in front of the other guests, and his words made Dr. Candy angry. Their argument only stopped in the end because there were noises in the garden. At once, all the guests went outside, where they saw 3 Indians and a small English boy dancing on the grass. Betteridge recognized them immediately as the Indians he had seen the day that Franklin had arrived. The ladies were amused by the strange music and the dancing of the Indians, until Murthwaite spoke to them in their own language. No one understood what he said, but the Indians quickly left the garden, and the guests went back into the house. Murthwaite stopped to talk to Franklin and Betteridge.
Those Indians are not dancers. I'm sure that they are priests,
warned Murthwaite.
They saw the moonstone on Miss Rachel's dress, and they will do anything to get it back. Your lives are in great danger.
What shall we do?
Asked Franklin.
You must take the diamond to Amsterdam and have it cut into smaller stones. The danger of the moonstone will end when it is cut up,
replied Murthwaite.
I will talk to Lady Verinder about it first thing in the morning,
said Franklin. When all the other guests had gone home, Lady Verinder, Rachel, and the 2 gentlemen were sitting in the library. Godfrey was drinking brandy and water, but Franklin didn't have anything. He looked tired, and he was worried about the diamond. Lady Verinder was worried too.
Rachel, where are you going to put the diamond tonight?
She asked.
in the Indian cabinet in my sitting room.
Rachel replied.
But there's no lock on the cabinet,
said Lady Verinder.
Why are you worried about that?
Asked Rachel.
Are there thieves in the house?
Lady Verinder saw that her daughter was determined, so she said good-night to everyone and went up to bed. Then Rachel, too, stood up to go. She shook hands politely with Godfrey, but smiled at Franklin before she left the room. After that, the gentleman went to bed. Franklin was still worried about the diamond, and he asked Betteridge to send some brandy and water to his room to help him sleep. After that, Betteridge made sure that all the doors and windows were safely locked, and finally, he too went to bed. At 8 o'clock the next morning, Penelope took Rachel's morning tea to her room as usual. When she entered the sitting room, Rachel was already up. She was staring at the Indian cabinet. The diamond was not there. Penelope ran to Betteridge's room.
Father! Father!
She cried.
The diamond is gone!
Betteridge hurried to Rachel's sitting room. Rachel was standing next to the empty cabinet, her face white.
The diamond has gone,
said Rachel quietly.
Please go away now. I want to be alone.
Rachel went into her bedroom, locked the door and refused to talk to anyone. Rachel's behaviour surprised everyone in the house. She had never been very interested in expensive jewels, but now she seemed to be deeply troubled by the loss of the moonstone. Lady Verinda was also troubled. A jewel worth over £20,000 had disappeared from her house. Was this her brother's revenge? Chapter 3. The Investigation. Franklin Blake immediately suspected that the Indians who had been at the house the day before had taken the stone. Betteridge agreed that they were interested in the moonstone, but he had locked all the doors and windows before he went to bed. It had not been possible for anyone to get into or out of the house that night. Franklin went to Frizinghall to speak to the police, and later that morning Detective Seagrave arrived at the house. Seagrave suspected that one of the servants had taken the jewel, and he put his policemen to guard their rooms. Then he went to Rachel's sitting room to begin the investigation. All the servants hurried after him to protest about the policeman in front of their room doors, but Seagrave told them to leave him alone.
And be more careful,
he said as he pointed to a smear in the paintwork at the bottom of the sitting-room door.
Look what you've done with your skirts.
The servants left, and the detective continued to examine Rachel's room. Suddenly, Rachel came out of her bedroom and said to Detective Seagrave,
"I don't want you here. My diamond is lost and you will never find it."
The detective's search did not find one clue. Franklin decided to ask his father to send a better policeman from London. He called Betteridge to the library. When Betteridge arrived, Rosanna Spearman was coming out of the library door. Betteridge waited for her to leave and then went into the room.
"Ah, Betteridge,"
said Franklin.
"Get a horse ready for me. I need to take this letter to Frizinghall. But," he continued, "before you go, I must say that Rosanna seems to know a lot about the moonstone."
Why? What did she say?
Asked Betteridge carefully. He did not want to say anything about Rosanna's past life as a thief or her time in prison.
"She said they will never find the diamond, nor the person who took it, and then she smiled at me. What does she mean?"
I don't know, sir, but I will talk to Lady Verinda about it.
Betteridge left to get a horse ready for Franklin. As he went past the dining room, he noticed that Rosanna was not eating lunch with the others. She had told them she was feeling ill and had gone to her room to lie down. Later that afternoon, Franklin rode over to Frizinghall to send the letter to his father. And that same afternoon, a woman who looked very like Rosanna Spearman was seen walking quickly along the road to Frizinghall. The next day, Detective Sergeant Cuff arrived from London on the morning train.
"Sergeant Cuff, the best detective in the country," thought Franklin.
Sergeant Cuff was a very serious man. He had grey hair, wore a dark suit and a white tie, and he never smiled. Cuff went immediately to examine Rachel's room. He soon noticed the smear near the bottom of the painted door.
"Interesting,"
said Cuff.
"Someone has walked past the door and made this smear, with a long skirt, perhaps, or a nightgown. I wonder when this happened. When was the door painted, and how long does the paint take to dry?"
"We painted this bit of the door on Wednesday, Rachel's birthday," explained Franklin. "We finished at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The paint takes 12 hours to dry."
At that moment, Rachel burst out of her bedroom. She stared angrily at Franklin and spoke to Sergeant Cuff.
Do not allow this man to help you in your investigation.
Thank you for your help, Miss Rachel,
said Cuff calmly.
And do you know anything about this smear on the door?
No,
said Rachel, and she went back into her bedroom. Penelope had been the last person to go into Rachel's room on the night the Moonstone disappeared. Sergeant Cuff went to ask her about the smear.
I left Miss Rachel's room at midnight,
said Penelope.
There was no smear on the door then, and I was very careful with my skirts not to make a smear.
I see,
said Cuff.
So the smear was made between midnight, when Miss Rachel went to bed on the night of her birthday, and 3 o'clock on Thursday morning. I think we have an important clue here.
Sergeant Cuff went to speak to Lady Verinder.
We must find out who or what made the smear on Rachel's door,
he said.
And then will we find the thief?
Asked Lady Verinder.
At the moment, madam, I do not say that the diamond was stolen. I say only that the diamond is missing. When we find the clothes that have paint on them, we will learn where the diamond is. I need to examine the clothes of everyone who stayed here on the night of the party.
Lady Verinder agreed, but Rachel refused to let anyone examine her clothes. If Rachel did not agree, then it was useless for Cuff to examine other people's clothes. He stopped his search for the paint smear and decided to speak to all of the servants one by one. He found out that on Thursday evening, the night after the Moonstone had disappeared, there had been a light on in Rosanna Spearman's room all night. Did her nightgown have paint on it? Was she making a new nightgown to hide the fact? That afternoon, Cuff saw Rosanna walking away from the house, and he decided to follow her. She went into a small cottage in a fishing village not far from the Shivering Sand. The cottage was the home of a fisherman called Yolland, and his daughter Lucy and Rosanna were close friends. When Rosanna left the cottage, she was carrying something under her coat, and she walked quickly towards the Shivering Sand. Later that evening, before it got dark, Sergeant Cuff went back to the fisherman's cottage and asked about Rosanna's visit.
Rosanna came here this afternoon to write a letter,
explained Mrs. Yolland.
She told me that she is going to leave her job with Lady Verinder. I don't know what the poor girl will do. She asked me for some things to help her move. I gave her a small box, like the one that sailors use to keep their maps dry, and a heavy chain. She said that she wanted the chain for her luggage.
Sergeant Cuff thanked Mrs. Yolland for her help and went back to the house. He knew that Rosanna had been a thief, but he did not suspect that she had stolen the diamond. The person that he suspected was Rachel herself. She had lost her diamond, but did nothing to help the investigation to find it. He thought that Rachel had probably asked Rosanna to help her hide the jewel. That night, Betteridge was walking across the hall to lock the front door when Franklin ran out of the library.
Betteridge,
Franklin said in a worried voice,
there's something wrong with Rosanna. She came into the library just now, and she wanted to tell me something. I'm sorry to say this, Betteridge, but I think that perhaps she wanted to tell me that she had stolen the diamond.
Both Franklin and Betteridge knew that Rachel's behaviour had been suspicious, but it was easier for the family to suspect that a poor servant like Rosanna had taken the diamond than the young lady of the house.
I wish to God that the Moonstone had never found its way into this house,
replied Betteridge. Chapter 4. Death at the Shivering Sand. It had rained in the night, and that morning there was a strong wind, and there were dark clouds in the sky. Sergeant Cuff planned to go to Frizinghall to continue his investigation there. When he walked out of the house, Betteridge and Franklin were in the garden. Although Franklin had been happy to see Cuff arrive the day before, he was now worried that the sergeant suspected that Rachel herself had hidden the diamond somewhere.
Is it true that Rosanna Spearman came to speak to you last night?
Asked Sergeant Cuff.
I have nothing to say,
replied Franklin. Just then, Rosanna Spearman and Penelope walked into the garden, near enough to hear the conversation.
If you have Rosanna's interests at heart, Mr. Franklin, you will explain everything,
continued Cuff.
I have no interest at all in Rosanna Spearman,
replied Franklin coldly.
I see,
said Sergeant Cuff, and he walked on to Frizinghall. Not long after the rest of the family had finished breakfast, Penelope came to tell her father some worrying news.
I'm afraid, Father,
she explained,
that Mr. Franklin's unkind words have hurt Rosanna deeply. She has become very quiet and is working like a woman in a dream.
Betteridge, who always felt sorry for Rosanna, went to talk to her. He explained that Franklin had spoken unkindly because he was angry with the sergeant. Rosanna said that she understood, but she still looked miserable.
Is there something you want to tell me?
Asked Betteridge.
No,
replied Rosanna.
but there is something I want to tell Mr. Franklin.
Mr. Franklin has gone for a walk,
said Betteridge.
It doesn't matter then. I won't trouble Mr. Franklin today,
answered Rosanna. Betteridge wanted to call the doctor to see Rosanna, but Dr. Candy had caught a bad cold after Rachel's birthday party. He then went to talk to Lady Verinda, but she was busy helping Rachel to prepare her luggage. Rachel was very troubled about the lost diamond, and she had decided to go and stay with her aunt and uncle, Godfrey Ablewhite's parents, in Frizinghall. Just before 2 o'clock, Sergeant Cuff returned from Frizinghall. He had spoken to Mr. Murthwaite about the dancers. Murthwaite was sure that the Indians had not stolen the diamond.
But they are still looking for it,
warned Murthwaite.
And they are clever enough to be able to find it.
Then Sergeant Cuff had asked about Rosanna Spearman. He found out that she had been to a shop on Thursday afternoon, the afternoon when she had pretended to be ill, and had bought some cloth, the kind of cloth that people use to make nightgowns. At 2 o'clock, Rachel came downstairs. She was wearing a soft yellow dress and jacket and a hat. She usually looked gentle, but now her eyes shone fiercely. She got into the carriage, while Lady Verinda, Sergeant Cuff and the servants stood at the door. Just then, Franklin ran up.
Goodbye, Rachel,
he shouted after her.
Drive on,
said Rachel to the driver, and she did not even turn to look at Franklin as she left. Although Franklin and Rachel had been such good friends, she refused, in front of everyone, to say goodbye to him. Franklin was deeply hurt. Sergeant Cuff was now sure that Rachel had the moonstone with her, and he went quickly to question Rosanna Spearman. But Rosanna had disappeared. About an hour before, one of the servants had seen Rosanna. She was running towards the shivering sand. Sergeant Cuff and Betteridge ran to find her as fast as they could. As they got nearer to the beach, the clouds grew darker and it started to rain. They saw Rosanna's small footprints going into the sand. But Betteridge and Cuff could go no further. This was the shivering sand. If anyone stepped into that part of the beach, the sand pulled them down within minutes. The sea was coming in quickly. There was no escape.
She has killed herself,
cried Betteridge, as he remembered Rosanna's sad face earlier that morning.
What do you mean?
Asked Cuff.
We must save her.
Oh, no, Sergeant Cuff. What the sand gets, the sand keeps.
Betteridge and Cuff returned to the house in silence. They found a note in Rosanna's room.
Forgive me, Mr. Betteridge. I have lived and died grateful for your kindness. Rosanna.
When Lady Verinder heard the news, she called Sergeant Cuff to her room immediately.
Why did Rosanna take her own life?
She asked him.
Rosanna didn't steal the diamond, but she was worried about another person. Your daughter. I suspect that Rachel has taken her own diamond, and that she now has the moonstone with her.
Sergeant Cuff, as Rachel's mother, I must tell you that you are wrong about her.
Madam, please think about the facts more carefully. Miss Rachel refused to have her clothes examined. She was clearly angry with Mr. Franklin today because he is the person who has helped most in this investigation. And finally, I think that she asked Rosanna Spearman to help her. Rosanna was once a thief, and she knew jewellers in London who could buy a jewel like the moonstone. Miss Rachel needed Rosanna to help her sell the diamond.
Lady Verinder listened silently. Then after a moment she said,
I will go to Rachel and tell her about Rosanna's death. I'm sure that she will tell me the truth.
And Lady Verinder left immediately for Frizinghall. Later that evening, a letter from Lady Verinder arrived for Sergeant Cuff.
Rachel told me, I feel truthfully, that she has not seen the diamond since she put it in the cabinet on the night of her birthday, and that she never spoke to Rosanna Spearman about the diamond.
With the letter came a cheque to pay Sergeant Cuff. Cuff prepared to go back to London that evening. Franklin also received a letter from Lady Verinder. It said that although she was very grateful for all Franklin's help, she felt it was better if he didn't try to see Rachel again for some time.
When I came here with that diamond, this was the happiest house in England,
thought Franklin.
And now the mystery of the jewel has destroyed the happiness of this family. The moonstone has indeed brought the revenge that Colonel Herncastle was looking for.
Chapter 5. The Mystery Moves to London. Franklin left Yorkshire that evening and went back to London. He couldn't stop thinking about Rachel or the mystery of the moonstone. He decided to go abroad and try to forget everything. Lady Verinder also wanted to help her daughter forget about the trouble that the diamond had brought, and decided to take Rachel to their house in London. Penelope prepared their luggage and went with them. Sergeant Cuff had also returned to London. Although Lady Verinder had asked him not to investigate the diamond mystery any more, he read an article in the newspaper a few days later with great interest.
30th of June, 1848. Yesterday afternoon, 2 gentlemen became victims of a strange attack. One gentleman was Mr. Septimus Luca, a jeweller from Lambeth, and the other was Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite. The gentleman was seen leaving a bank in Lombard Street at the same time. Later that afternoon, Mr. Ablewhite received a letter which told him to go to a house in Northumberland Street. When he entered the house, Mr. Ablewhite noticed a small statue of an Indian god on the table. He was led into a room where 3 men with dark skins were waiting. Suddenly, from behind, Mr. Ablewhite felt an arm around his neck, and he was thrown to the floor. The attackers searched Mr. Ablewhite very carefully, but they did not find what they were looking for, and quickly left the house. A short while later, the same thing happened to Mr. Luca at a house in Alfred Place near Tottenham Court Road. Mr. Luca was thrown to the floor, tied up and searched. 3 dark-skinned men were seen leaving the house. After the attack, Mr. Luca noticed that a bank receipt was missing from his pocket. The receipt was for a valuable jewel that Mr. Luca had left at the bank that morning. Mr. Luca hurried to the bank, but the attackers had not yet been there, and the jewel was safe.
People started talking about the news, and soon there were rumours all around London that the attacks were something to do with the missing Moonstone diamond. A few days later, Godfrey Ablewhite went to visit Lady Verinder and Rachel at their house in Montague Street.
Please, don't worry about me,
he said charmingly when they asked him about the attack.
It was just a mistake. They thought I was another man.
But the 3 Indian men that attacked you, were they the same men that came to the house on the evening of my birthday party?
Asked Rachel quickly.
My dear Rachel, it happened so quickly. I did not see their faces well enough to say, he replied calmly.
And what about Mr. Luca's bank receipt? People say it was for a valuable jewel,
continued Rachel.
A jewel like the Moonstone?
Godfrey began to look very uncomfortable, but Rachel became more excited.
And they say that you, Godfrey, sold it to Mr. Luca.
Lady Verinder couldn't believe what her daughter was saying. Rachel jumped up from her chair and declared,
I know the hand that took the Moonstone, and I know that you are innocent, Godfrey. I will write to the newspapers and tell them myself.
Just then, there was a knock at the door. Some friends had arrived to take Rachel out for the day. Rachel kissed her mother, said goodbye to Godfrey, and left. Later that afternoon, Lady Verinder had another visitor. It was Mr. Bruff, the family lawyer. Since they had moved to London, Lady Verinder had been unwell. Her doctor had told her that she was seriously ill. She knew that she did not have long to live, so she had called Mr. Bruff to help her write her will. Mr. Bruff was also anxious to talk to Lady Verinder about another matter.
Have you heard what people are saying about your nephew, Godfrey Ablewhite?
Mr. Bruff asked.
I'm afraid that since the attack by the Indians, there are rumours that he stole the diamond.
What a stupid idea,
replied Lady Verinder.
Sergeant Cuff was sure that my own daughter had taken the diamond and hidden it. This terrible Moonstone is destroying my family.
Lady Verinder, I have known your family for a long time. Miss Rachel is the most honest young lady that I have ever met. She could not possibly do such a thing. But I'm not so sure about Godfrey Ablewhite.
I must tell you, Mr. Bruff, that earlier today Rachel declared that Godfrey was innocent.
Well, if Rachel says that he is innocent, then I believe her. But then who...
Mr. Bruff and Lady Verinder did not want to think about the mystery any more, and they turned to the matter of the will. The next day Rachel again went out with her friends. Lady Verinda was not feeling well and stayed at home to rest, and Godfrey Ablewhite went out with Rachel instead of her. When they got back home, Godfrey wanted to talk to Rachel, and so they went to the library. There, Godfrey sat down opposite Rachel.
Rachel,
he declared,
I am hopelessly in love with you.
But Godfrey,
Rachel protested.
didn't we agree on the day of my birthday party to be friends and no more?
I have tried, Rachel,
Godfrey replied.
but my feelings for you have not changed.
I have something to tell you, Godfrey, that will make you change your mind. I was in love with another man, but he betrayed me, and I will never, never see him again.
Rachel spoke angrily and burst into tears. But when Godfrey realized how honest Rachel was, he told her that he loved her even more. He knelt down in front of her.
Dearest Rachel,
Godfrey said gently,
there is a way to forget the man that betrayed you. Please marry me.
Rachel protested, but Godfrey went on asking her to marry him. He was a very good speaker, and finally Rachel agreed. Just then, they heard a servant shouting,
Miss Rachel, come quickly! Your mother has fallen ill!
At once, Rachel ran to her mother's room and threw her arms around Lady Verinda, but she was already dead. Chapter 6. Unexpected News. Lady Verinda was buried at the small cemetery in the park of the house in Yorkshire. In her will, she had left everything to Rachel, her only daughter. She had also asked her brother, old Mr. Ablewhite, Rachel's uncle in Frizinghall, to look after Rachel either until she reached the age of 21 or until she got married. Old Mr. Ablewhite knew that Rachel was engaged to his son, so he was careful to make sure that Rachel was made as comfortable as possible. About a week after Rachel had left London to go back to Yorkshire, an unexpected visitor arrived at Mr. Bruff's office. The man was tall and thin, very well dressed in a fine suit, and dark-skinned. Mr. Bruff did not usually agree to meet strangers in his office, but he supposed that the man was an Indian, and that he might know something about the Moonstone. Mr. Bruff had known the Moonstone for a long time. He had been Colonel Herncastle's lawyer, and Bruff had arranged the Colonel's will, which had left the diamond to Rachel.
I have come, sir,
began the Indian gentleman very politely,
to ask you to lend me some money. Please keep this jewel box until I pay back the debt.
The Indian placed a small black box covered in jewels on the desk. It was worth a lot of money.
I'm afraid, sir,
replied Mr. Bruff,
that lending money is not my business. You need to visit a jeweller, like Mr. Luca. He can lend you money for this jewel box.
I see,
said the Indian gentleman.
Then I am very sorry to trouble you. But before I go, could I ask just one question? In this country, if you borrow money, when must you pay back the debt?
The law in this country says that you must pay back your debt in 1 year.
Thank you very much for your help,
said the Indian gentleman, and he bowed politely and left. That evening, Mr. Bruff went to a dinner party. One of the guests at the party was Mr. Murthwaite, the famous Indian traveller. After dinner, Mr. Bruff was sitting next to Murthwaite, and he began talking about the strange visit to his office that afternoon.
Said
Murthwaite when he heard the story.
So the Moonstone is in London?
What do you mean?
Asked Bruff.
The Moonstone is missing. Everyone knows that.
Let me tell you what I know about this dangerous jewel. A number of Indian priests have been following the Moonstone, since it was taken from the palace of Seringapatam in 1799. They have been in this country and are waiting for their chance to take the diamond back to the statue of the moon god where it belongs. When Colonel Herncastle died and the diamond was taken to Yorkshire, this was the chance that the Indian priests were waiting for. Unfortunately for them, Franklin Blake changed his travel plans at the last moment, and the Indians lost their chance to attack Franklin and recover the diamond. But they saw the jewel on Rachel's dress at the birthday party and waited for their next chance. And when did we next hear about the Indian gentleman?
Asked Murthwaite.
The attack on Mr. Luca and Godfrey Ablewhite,
Answered Bruff.
That's right,
Said Murthwaite.
They followed the diamond back to London. Someone left it with Mr. Luca, and the Indians took a second chance to recover it. Luckily, Mr. Luca had already put the diamond in the bank, and it was safe. But you understand the Indian gentleman's question, don't you?
Asked Murthwaite.
Of course, I see now. Someone borrowed money from Mr. Luca and gave him the diamond to keep until the debt is paid back. The person must pay back the debt in a year, and at that time Mr. Luca will give back the diamond.
And that will be the Indian priest's third chance to recover the moonstone,
warned Murthwaite. In her will, Lady Verinder had left Rachel a great fortune. But the will also said that Rachel could not sell any of the land or houses that Lady Verinder had left her. She could only live comfortably from a yearly income for the rest of her life. Rachel was lonely without her mother, and, until she got married, she was living with her aunt and uncle in Frizinghall. Mrs. Ablewhite saw how miserable Rachel was, and took her to live in Brighton, a seaside town not far from London. Soon after Mrs. Ablewhite and Rachel had arrived at the house in Brighton, they received a visit from Mr. Bruff. That afternoon, Mr. Bruff asked Rachel to take a walk along the beach with him. He had something to tell her.
Rachel, I hear that you are engaged to Godfrey Ablewhite. Do you really love him?
Asked Mr. Bruff.
I am marrying him because it is my only chance to find a little happiness in my life,
Rachel answered.
And do you believe that Godfrey loves you?
He asked. Rachel stopped.
Mr. Bruff, if you have something to tell me about Godfrey, then please say it.
Mr. Bruff explained that soon after Lady Verinder's death, Godfrey had visited his offices and had asked to examine Lady Verinder's will. Mr. Bruff was worried that Godfrey was marrying Rachel only for her money. Rachel's face became white, and she held onto Mr. Bruff's arm. Finally she said,
I will talk to Godfrey myself. Thank you for what you have told me, Mr. Bruff.
The next day, Godfrey Ablewhite arrived from London. At once Rachel told him that she had changed her mind and no longer wished to marry him.
I'm sorry, Godfrey. I wanted to forget about the other man that I loved. This was not a good reason for agreeing to marry you. I made a mistake,
she explained. But Godfrey did not protest. He accepted her change of heart immediately. At first, Rachel was surprised by Godfrey's behaviour, and then she realised that he had indeed only been interested in her fortune. The fact that Rachel could not sell any of her houses or land meant that Godfrey could not get a large sum of money if he married her. Mr. Bruff had been right. Godfrey had never really been in love with her. Later that day, Rachel left the house in Brighton and went to live with Mr. Bruff's family in London. Chapter 7. An Important Discovery. In the spring of 1849, Franklin Blake was still travelling abroad. Although he had already been away for 9 months, he was still not able to forget about Rachel. Then, one day, Franklin received news that his father had died. A letter from Mr. Bruff told him that he had inherited a great fortune and asked him to come home immediately. As Franklin got nearer and nearer to England, he thought about seeing Rachel again. When he met Mr. Bruff in London, Franklin's first question was about her. Mr. Bruff gave him Rachel's address, and half an hour later, Franklin was knocking at her door.
Miss Rachel is not at home,
said the servant. Although Franklin visited Rachel again and again, and wrote letters to her, she wanted nothing to do with him. Franklin was sure that her silence was because of the Moonstone mystery. Franklin was determined to find out the truth, and so he took the next train to Yorkshire. When Franklin arrived at the house in Yorkshire, the old servant Betteridge was happy but surprised to see him.
"What has brought you here, Mr. Franklin?"
he asked.
The same as brought me here almost a year ago. The Moonstone,
answered Franklin.
"That moonstone has brought nothing but trouble. It's better to leave it alone."
Do you remember how angry Rachel was when she left this house? She behaved so unkindly to me and refused to say goodbye. Well, she is still angry with me. I'm going to solve the mystery once and for all. Perhaps then she will speak to me again.
Betteridge had watched Rachel and Franklin become good friends during the month before the birthday party, and many of the servants had hoped at that time to see them become man and wife. Betteridge could see now that Franklin was still in love with Rachel a year later.
Tell me, Betteridge, did anything happen after I left the house?
Asked Franklin excitedly.
Well, the day after you left, I received a visit from Limping Lucy, the daughter of Yolland, the fisherman. She brought a letter for you. Do you remember the servant, Rosanna Spearman?
Asked Betteridge.
Of course. She was the poor woman who took her life at the Shivering Sand,
replied Franklin.
That's right,
continued Betteridge.
Well, a few days before that, she visited the Yollands' cottage and wrote a letter to you. She gave the letter to her only friend, Limping Lucy, and asked her to deliver it to you in person. You had already gone back to London, and Lucy refused to give the letter to me, so she still has it now.
A letter from Rosanna Spearman. I remember that she behaved very strangely. I thought that she wanted to tell me something. Perhaps she wrote about it in the letter.
First thing the next morning, the two men walked to the fisherman's cottage. When they stepped into Mrs. Yolland's kitchen, they found a young woman there. She was small and thin, with dark, wild hair and fierce eyes. She stared angrily at Franklin and limped across the kitchen towards them.
This is Mr. Franklin Blake,
Betteridge told Lucy.
You have a letter from Rosanna for him.
Without a word, Lucy fetched the letter and took Franklin outside. They walked a little way from the cottage and stopped behind some boats.
So you are Rosanna's murderer,
she said to him boldly.
What do you mean?
Asked Franklin angrily.
Rosanna told me. There are men who are worth dying for, and Franklin Blake is one of them. She took care of you and worried about you, but you never even noticed her. She was my dearest friend, and you took her away from me. Take your letter. I hope that I never see you again.
She threw the letter at Franklin and limped away noisily. Franklin opened Rosanna's letter and read it at once. It was a page of instructions.
Go to the Shivering Sand when the sea is low. Walk out to sea along the low rocks on the far side of the beach. when you can see the Yolan's cottage at the other side of the shivering sand, then lie down on the rocks and feel in the sand at the edge of the rocks. You will find a chain that is tied to the rocks. Pull the chain out of the sand.
Franklin gave the message to Betteridge to read.
So, Rosanna was hiding something after all,
said Betteridge.
The sea is going out now. Let's go straight to the shivering sand.
They soon reached the lonely beach. It was a fine spring day, and the wet sand shone in the sunlight. The sea was very low now. Carefully, Franklin walked along the rocks and followed Rosanna's instructions. He knelt down and carefully felt at the edge of the rocks for the chain. As Franklin looked across the beach, he thought he could see Rosanna's ghost coming out of the sand to help him. He quickly searched for the chain and put his hand into the low water. He felt the chain and pulled it. A small black box appeared. Franklin ran back to Betteridge with the box, and they opened it at once. Inside they found a letter and a man's nightgown. When they examined the nightgown more carefully, they found some paint on it. They remembered Sergeant Cuff's words.
When you find the clothes that made the paint smear, you can find the diamond.
They looked inside the nightgown to find who it belonged to. They saw the letters F.B. Franklin had indeed discovered the truth about the moonstone. Although he did not remember the fact, he himself seemed to be the thief. Later, back at the house, Franklin and Betteridge tried to understand what they had found.
I am innocent,
said Franklin.
I did not take the diamond, but the evidence points to me.
Betteridge poured another glass of brandy and told Franklin to read the letter that they had found in the small black box.
Friday, the 23rd of June, 1848. Dear Sir, when you read these words, I will be dead. You may wonder why I have behaved so strangely. It is because I love you. I know that you are in love with Miss Rachel. Every day I have hoped that you will notice me, but now I realise that my love for you is hopeless. And with this letter you will find your nightgown. The day that the diamond went missing, I followed the other servants to Miss Rachel's room to complain to Detective Seagrave. It was then that he pointed to the smear in the paint on Miss Rachel's door. Afterwards, I went to do my work. I went to your room to make your bed and put away your nightgown. To my great surprise, I discovered a paint smear on your nightgown. When I thought that you had stolen the diamond, my feelings for you grew stronger. You were a thief like me. And if you wanted to sell the diamond and get money, then I could help you. I could take you to a man in London that buys such valuable jewels.
The letter continued to explain how, to save Franklin, Rosanna had bought cloth and made a new nightgown to replace the one with a paint smear on it, and how she had hidden the evidence in the quicksand of the shivering sand. When Franklin and Betteridge finished reading the letter, they were both deep in thought. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. A strange-looking man came in. He had a dark, wrinkled face and curly hair, which was black on top and very white at the sides of his head. His soft brown eyes looked towards Franklin, who was staring rudely back at him.
I'm sorry. I had no idea that you were busy, Mr. Betteridge. Here's the list of sick people for next week,
he said, and the man left the room as suddenly as he had entered.
Who was that?
Asked Franklin.
That's Dr. Candy's assistant,
explained Betteridge.
The doctor fell ill after Rachel's birthday party, and he has not yet recovered from his illness. His assistant does all his work now. Every week he brings me a list of the sick people in Frizinghall, and we send wine and food to them.
And what is the man's name?
Asked Franklin.
Ezra Jennings. An ugly name for an ugly man.
Franklin decided to take the letter and the nightgown to Mr. Bruff, and to ask for his advice. On the way to the station, Franklin asked Betteridge,
Was I drunk on the night of Rachel's birthday?
Of course not. In fact, you looked miserable, and I took you a glass of brandy and water before you went to bed.
And, Betteridge, have you ever seen me sleepwalking?
Sleepwalking? No, never,
the old servant replied.
And, sir, suppose that you did take the diamond. Then how is it in London now?
At the station, Franklin was just about to get on the train for London when he looked over to the small shop. There was that strange man, Ezra Jennings, again. He was talking to someone, but he looked up and saw Franklin getting on the train. When Franklin arrived back in London, he went straight to Mr. Bruff's house and showed him the letter and the nightgown. After he had examined them carefully, Mr. Bruff said,
Franklin, this is a very serious matter. Now I understand Rachel's behaviour. She thinks that you stole her diamond. The next step in this investigation is to speak to Rachel.
I want to speak to her myself, then,
said Franklin.
Are you sure?
Asked Mr. Bruff.
You told me that Rachel has refused to meet you.
Mr. Bruff, please invite Rachel to your home tomorrow. I will come here at 3 o'clock to meet her, but don't tell her that I am coming. Give me a key so that I can enter your house through the garden.
Mr. Bruff agreed to the plan. Chapter 8. An Experiment. At 3 o'clock the next afternoon, Franklin opened the door into Mr. Bruff's garden. As he walked towards the house, he could hear Rachel playing the piano. Franklin went into the house and made his way to the music room. He stood outside the room for a few moments before he opened the door. When Rachel saw Franklin, she stopped playing the piano and stood up. Rachel and Franklin looked at each other across the room, and for a few minutes they stood still.
Rachel,
said Franklin softly. Rachel slowly walked towards Franklin. He looked at her beautiful face and shining bright eyes. He took her in his arms and kissed her. At first Rachel accepted his kisses, but then she pushed him away angrily.
Is this the behaviour of a gentleman?
She asked angrily.
Why do you come here secretly and make me kiss you? You were once very dear to me, but now...
She turned away and began to cry.
Rachel, please listen. Let me explain,
said Franklin gently. He wanted to tell her about his discovery of the nightgown and about Rosanna Spearman's letter.
There is nothing to explain,
cried Rachel between her tears.
I saw you take my diamond with my own eyes.
Please, Rachel, you must believe me. I am innocent. I do not remember taking the diamond. You must tell me everything that happened that night.
Rachel had kept her secret for a long time, and it was hard for her to speak about what had happened.
At about 12 o'clock, after we had said good night, I went to bed. But I couldn't sleep, and I got up to get a book from my sitting room. I opened my bedroom door and heard a noise outside. Then I saw a light under the sitting room door, and I blew out my candle. The door opened, and I saw you. The light from your candle clearly showed me your face. I remember your eyes. They were brighter than usual. You walked straight to the cabinet and you took the moonstone. You held it in your right hand. You stopped to think for a few moments and then you left the room. With the diamond.
Franklin was silent. He was indeed the person who had stolen the jewel. After a while, Franklin asked,
"Why didn't you tell us about this? Why did you keep it secret?"
What a stupid question,
said Rachel angrily.
How can I tell everyone that the man I love is a thief? I didn't tell anyone, but I wrote you a letter. I offered to help you if you needed money, and I asked you to return the diamond. But you never got that letter because I destroyed it when you went to fetch the police. You pretended to everyone that you wanted to help me find the jewel that you had stolen.
Franklin couldn't listen any more.
"Rachel, I will prove that I am innocent. I will not see you again until I can prove my innocence."
Franklin left, and tears filled Rachel's eyes once more when she thought of never seeing Franklin again. That evening, Mr. Bruff came to see Franklin.
"Well,"
said Mr. Bruff, when Franklin had finished telling him Rachel's story,
"we have discovered who took the diamond, but we have not yet found the moonstone itself. How did it get to London? And who borrowed money from Mr. Luca?"
The person who had borrowed money from Mr. Luca had to pay back the debt at the end of June. And, at the same time, Mr. Luca had to return the diamond to this person. Mr. Bruff had a plan.
"At the end of the month, I will send someone to watch the bank and tell us when Mr. Luca goes to fetch the moonstone,"
explained Mr. Bruff.
"If we can discover who borrowed Mr. Luca's money, I'm sure that we can find the person who took the diamond."
"But it's nearly 2 weeks until the end of the month. I can't wait until then,"
said Franklin.
"We need Sergeant Cuff's help."
The next morning, Franklin went to find Sergeant Cuff. The detective had stopped working with the police, and now he was living in a cottage in the country. But when Franklin got there, the sergeant was not at home. He was away in Ireland. So Franklin left a letter which told him that there was news about the moonstone. When Franklin got back to London, a letter from Betteridge was waiting. It said that Dr. Candy wanted to speak to Franklin the next time he came to Frizinghall. Franklin prepared to go to Yorkshire immediately. Dr. Candy had been a guest at Rachel's birthday dinner, and Franklin hoped that he remembered something. Franklin needed any clue to help him. Before leaving, Franklin called on Godfrey Ablewhite. Godfrey had also been a guest at the birthday dinner, and Franklin wanted to ask him for information too. But Godfrey had left the day before to go travelling in Europe. So Franklin travelled to Yorkshire and went to visit Dr. Candy. Franklin was surprised to see how Dr. Candy had changed. The doctor's illness had turned his hair grey, and his face had become wrinkled. But the worst thing about the illness was that Dr. Candy had lost his memory.
"Dr. Candy, you sent a message to say that you had something to tell me,"
began Franklin.
"Oh, yes, I sent you a message,"
said Dr. Candy.
"That's right."
"Was it something to do with Miss Verinda's birthday dinner?"
asked Franklin.
"That's it, the birthday dinner. It was a very pleasant dinner, wasn't it?"
said Dr. Candy. The conversation continued, but Dr. Candy couldn't remember what he wanted to tell Franklin. Franklin decided to leave, and he went to the door. At the door, he met Ezra Jennings, who was on his way out to see one of Dr. Candy's patients. He was taking the same road as Franklin, so they walked together. Ezra spoke about Dr. Candy's illness.
After the birthday dinner, Dr. Candy went home in the rain and got very wet. Later, he caught a fever, Mr. Franklin, and nearly died. I took care of him and spent many hours at his side. During the fever, Dr. Candy spoke a lot, but it was difficult to understand what he was trying to say.
Did he say anything about the moonstone?
Asked Franklin.
He said nothing about the moonstone, Mr. Franklin,
replied Ezra.
And did he say my name? Or talk about me?
Sir, I am Dr. Candy's assistant. I'm not free to tell you what he said to me during a fever.
Ezra Jennings, I am in love with a woman. If I don't prove my innocence, I can never see her again. Please help me.
Ezra Jennings had had a hard and miserable life. He, too, had once been in love, and he had a child that he could now never see. He looked at this young, fine-looking man and felt sorry for him.
You are in love, I see. Then, perhaps there is something that I can tell you. Come to Dr. Candy's house this evening.
That evening, at Dr. Candy's house, Franklin Blake and Ezra Jennings sat in a small room. Ezra asked Franklin to tell him about the argument with Dr. Candy at dinner on the night of Rachel's birthday.
I was not sleeping well at the time,
began Franklin,
because I had stopped smoking. Smoking helps me to calm down, but I stopped because Rachel didn't like the smell. When I spoke about this at the dinner table, Dr. Candy told me that taking medicine could help me sleep. But I refused his medicine and said that I didn't believe it could help me, or anyone.
And were you worried about the diamond that night?
Asked Ezra.
Yes. I heard Rachel's conversation with Lady Verinda about putting the diamond in the cabinet. I thought that it wasn't safe to leave it there.
Then I think that I can explain what happened that night,
said Ezra.
This is what Dr. Candy said during his fever. I wrote down his words. Here they are.
Franklin read the page of notes that Ezra gave him.
Mr. Franklin Blake can't sleep at night, refuses my medicine at the dinner table, says medicine doesn't work in front of all the guests. I'll teach him what medicine can do. Lady Verinda's medicine box, 1 small spoon of opium. He'll never know. He'll drink the opium with brandy. Excellent sleep. Now, Mr. Blake, what do you think about medicine?
So, you see, Dr. Candy was angry with you about the argument during dinner, and he wanted to prove that medicine could work. He secretly put opium into the brandy and water that Betteridge brought you that night.
Ezra Jennings explained.
You see, at first, opium awakens the mind, but later it makes you very sleepy. You were worried about the diamond that night, so in your sleep you went to take it in order to keep it safe. You didn't know what you were doing or where you put the diamond. There is only one way to prove your innocence, Mr. Blake. An experiment.
Ezra Jennings wanted to give Franklin opium again and to watch what he did in his sleep. Ezra thought that Franklin perhaps could repeat what he had done when he took the diamond a year before, and that he could even show people where he had put the stolen diamond.
But the diamond is in London,
Franklin protested.
It can't possibly be in Lady Verinda's house.
Some people think that the Moonstone diamond is in London. But how do we know that Mr. Luca's valuable jewel is indeed the Moonstone? I'm sure that this experiment will show us where it is.
Franklin agreed to do the experiment. First, he had to stop smoking again. Ezra Jennings wrote to Rachel and asked her to let them use her house for the experiment. Rachel agreed immediately, and asked if she could watch the experiment too. Ezra secretly agreed to this, but he was careful not to tell Franklin about it. Then Ezra asked Betteridge to prepare the house in exactly the same way as it had been for the birthday party. Next he wrote to Mr. Bruff in secret, and asked him also to be a witness at the experiment. 10 days later, everything was ready, and for 10 days Franklin had slept badly. That evening, Franklin and Ezra went to the house and had dinner. Rachel and Mr. Bruff arrived a little while later, but Ezra didn't tell Franklin about their arrival. Rachel was excited about the experiment and the chance to prove Franklin's innocence. At 11 o'clock, Franklin prepared to go to bed. Mr. Bruff and Betteridge were both hiding in Franklin's bedroom. Rachel put a large stone in the Indian cabinet and waited in her bedroom. Ezra Jennings poured a spoon of opium into a glass of brandy for Franklin to drink. Then Ezra sat down at the bottom of Franklin's bed and watched him. Franklin lay down to sleep and didn't move for some time. Then, suddenly, he sat up in bed and started speaking to himself.
Those Indians may be in the house.
Then Franklin lay down again. After another 5 minutes, he sat up and started talking again.
The cabinet doesn't lock. Anybody can take it.
Next, Franklin stood up, took the candle by his bed, and walked to Rachel's room. Rachel was standing at the door of her bedroom. Ezra, Betteridge, and Bruff followed Franklin quietly. Through the open door, they watched him go into Rachel's sitting room. Franklin went straight to the cabinet, picked up the stone, and turned round. He walked to the middle of the room and stopped.
Now, is he going to show us where he put the diamond?
Thought Ezra Jennings. Chapter 9. The Truth. Franklin was standing in the middle of Rachel's sitting room, and he was holding the stone in his right hand. Ezra Jennings, Mr. Bruff, Betteridge, and Rachel were watching him. What was his next move? Suddenly, Franklin dropped the stone out of his hand, went over to the sofa, lay down, and went into a deep sleep.
Now,
said Ezra Jennings quietly to everyone,
does this experiment prove that Mr. Franklin came here and took the moonstone without knowing what he was doing?
They all agreed that the experiment had proved Franklin's innocence.
Mr. Jennings,
continued Mr. Bruff,
we are very grateful to you. You have proved part of the mystery for us, but we still don't know what happened to the diamond after Franklin took it. Now, I hope that I can solve the rest of the mystery. For the last 2 days, someone has been watching the bank in Lombard Street. He's waiting to see when Mr. Luca comes to fetch the jewel, which we all believe to be the moonstone, Mr. Jennings. I must get back to London first thing in the morning.
They all went to bed, and left Franklin to sleep on the sofa in Rachel's sitting room. He slept deeply until 8 o'clock in the morning, and when he opened his eyes, he saw Rachel kneeling beside him.
You are innocent, Franklin,
she said.
Now we can be together again.
Again, Franklin took Rachel in his arms and kissed her, but this time she did not push him away. After breakfast, Franklin and Rachel joined Mr. Bruff on the journey back to London. By 11 o'clock that morning, the house in Yorkshire was again quiet and empty. When they arrived in London, Mr. Bruff was met at the station by a small boy. He was a poor boy. His clothes were old and worn, and he had a strange-looking face with large, round eyes.
This is Gooseberry,
said Mr. Bruff.
He may have strange-looking eyes, but this boy notices everything, and he's quick. He has brought us some interesting news. Mr. Luca is on his way to the bank.
Bruff and Franklin quickly said goodbye to Rachel and got into a cab with Gooseberry. They hurried across town to the bank in Lombard Street. Franklin looked at the people in the bank, but he couldn't see the Indians anywhere. The only person with dark skin was a tall man with a thick, dark beard and a sailor's hat and coat.
Perhaps he's working as a spy for the Indians,
thought Franklin. Mr. Luca came out of an office and slowly made his way to the door of the bank. Franklin and Bruff watched him carefully. As Mr. Luca walked past a man in a grey suit, they both saw Mr. Luca's hand move. Had Mr. Luca given him something? Gooseberry had already disappeared, so they decided to follow the man in the grey suit. When the man had finished his business at the bank, Bruff and Franklin followed him onto a bus. They got off with a man in Oxford Street and followed him to a shop that sold medicine. Mr. Bruff knew the shop owner and learnt from him that they had followed the wrong man.
The man in the grey suit is a shop assistant,
said Bruff.
I'm sure he knows nothing about the Moonstone. Let's hope that Gooseberry is doing a better job than us.
While Franklin and Bruff had followed an innocent man, Gooseberry had followed the tall sailor with a dark face. Gooseberry noticed Mr. Luca pass something to him, and as the sailor quickly left the bank, Gooseberry followed him. The sailor got into a cab. Gooseberry jumped on the back, and they went to Tower Wharf. At the wharf, a steamboat was preparing to leave for Rotterdam the next morning. But the sailor didn't get on the ship. Instead, he went into a cheap restaurant nearby. Gooseberry waited outside and saw a mechanic standing on the other side of the road. As Gooseberry watched, a cab came by and stopped in front of the mechanic. Someone put his head out of the cab to talk to the mechanic. Someone with a dark face, like an Indian. And a few minutes later, the cab drove away. After he had eaten, the tall sailor went to a pub called the Wheel of Fortune. Gooseberry followed him into the pub, and so did the mechanic. The tall man asked the landlord for a room for the night, and the landlord gave him room number 10. It was a small room at the top of the house. A servant took the sailor up to the room. Gooseberry decided to wait a little before he left the pub, so he sat down. Just then, there was a lot of noise upstairs. The landlord went to see what the noise was about, and a few minutes later came back with a mechanic. The mechanic was drunk and was trying to get into room number 10. The mechanic was thrown out of the pub, but when Gooseberry followed him down the street, he noticed that the man was not really drunk at all. But by now it was late, and Gooseberry went home. At 10 o'clock the next morning, Gooseberry went straight to Franklin Blake's house to report what he had seen. He was taken into the sitting room, but stopped when he saw that Franklin had a visitor, an older, sad-looking man.
"Come in, Gooseberry,"
said Franklin.
"This is Sergeant Cuff. He has come to help us solve the mystery. Please report everything to us."
Gooseberry had heard of the famous Sergeant Cuff, and he told his story with great excitement. Sergeant Cuff was sure that Gooseberry had followed the right man, and 10 minutes later the three of them were in a cab on their way to the Wheel of Fortune. When they arrived at the pub, the landlord was hurrying down the stairs.
"What do you want?"
he said angrily when he saw them.
I am Sergeant Cuff, and we've come to ask about a man who stayed here last night.
explained Cuff.
A tall, dark man, dressed in sailor's clothes.
The landlord also recognised the name of this famous detective and spoke more politely.
I'm very pleased that you are here, sir. The man you were looking for has been troubling us. We've been calling him since 7 o'clock this morning, but he doesn't answer.
Do you think he's left without paying?
asked Cuff.
Well, it is possible, I suppose,
explained the landlord.
Room number 10 is at the top of the building, and there's a small door in the ceiling into the roof. If he climbed through the door onto the roof, he could then get into the house next door, which is empty. That way, he could easily leave without paying.
After that, the landlord went to fetch a saw. Then, with Cuff and Franklin, he went back up to room number 10 and started to cut through the door. Then, the three men pushed and pushed the door until at last they broke into the room. The tall sailor had not left the room. He was still in bed, with a pillow over his face. The landlord removed the pillow, and there, under it, a dark face, with its eyes wide open, was staring up at them.
He's dead!
shouted the landlord.
Fetch a doctor!
Gooseberry had followed the men into the room. He didn't seem worried about the dead man. He was pointing excitedly at a small wooden box on a small table next to the bed. The box was empty. With the box, there was a banker's receipt. It said that the box belonged to Mr. Luca.
"Robbery!"
shouted Gooseberry.
"And murder!"
Sergeant Cuff looked at the man again and noticed a thin white line between the top of his dark face and his hair. Cuff took hold of the man's hair and pulled. The hair came off in his hands. It was a wig. Then Cuff took the man's beard off. And then he took some water and a towel and started washing the man's face. It became clear that the dark skin was also part of the strange disguise. Franklin couldn't believe his eyes. The face of the man in front of him was that of Godfrey Ablewhite. It didn't seem possible, but it was true. Later that morning, a doctor came to examine the dead body and declared that Godfrey Ablewhite's death was indeed a murder. Someone, or a group of people, had held the pillow over Mr. Ablewhite's nose and mouth in order to kill him. When they asked Mr. Luca about the box on the table beside the bed, he said that it had contained the Moonstone diamond. Everyone agreed that someone, or a group of people, had murdered Godfrey Ablewhite in order to steal the Moonstone from him. And everyone agreed that the murderer, or murderers, were most probably the Indians. Sergeant Cuff made further investigations and discovered that the Indians had entered room number 10 through the small door in the ceiling. They had come through the roof of the empty house next door and had moved silently onto the roof of the pub and down into the room where Godfrey Ablewhite was sleeping. They knew that he was there because the mechanic, who was their spy, had told them. A small piece of gold cloth was found in room number 10. It was the kind of cloth that was not made or sold anywhere in England. The only place to find such cloth was India. The same morning that Godfrey Ablewhite was found dead, the three Indians were seen in Tower Wharf. They were getting onto the steamboat, which was sailing to Rotterdam. It was the beginning of their long journey back to India. They were taking the Moonstone back to the place where it belonged. Chapter 10. The mystery is solved. Sergeant Cuff and Mr. Bruff continued their investigations after Godfrey Ablewhite's death. With some important information from Mr. Luca, they were able to find out how and why Godfrey had stolen the diamond. Godfrey Ablewhite had had a respectable job and was well known for his charity work and for helping poor people. But his death uncovered another, secret side of Godfrey's life. He had also owned a large villa on the edge of London. The villa was full of fine pictures, statues, and beautiful furniture. A beautiful young woman, Godfrey's lover, lived in the house. She had many expensive clothes and jewels. Over the years, Godfrey had paid for everything: the villa, the pictures, and the jewels. But where had the money come from? Some years before, in his work as a lawyer, Godfrey had received a large sum of money to keep safely for a young client. The client had inherited a fortune of £20,000, but was unable to receive the money until he reached the age of 21. Twice a year, Godfrey had to pay his client an income of £300, and in February 1850, Godfrey had to return the £20,000 to his client. Although the money did not belong to Godfrey, he had forged cheques in order to spend it. By the end of 1847, he had spent every penny of his client's fortune to pay for the villa and everything it contained. He was also no longer able to pay the twice-yearly income of £300 to his client. On the day of Rachel's birthday party, Godfrey had seen her birthday present from Colonel Herncastle. Because he realized how valuable the diamond was, Godfrey had asked Rachel to marry him that afternoon. But Rachel was in love with Franklin, so she had refused him. That night, Godfrey was unable to sleep because his money troubles were keeping him awake. He heard Franklin walking outside his room. He got up and saw Franklin walking towards Rachel's room with a candle. He followed Franklin and watched him through the open door of Rachel's sitting room. He saw Franklin take the moonstone, and he could see that Rachel was watching him too, from her bedroom door. When Franklin left Rachel's sitting room, he walked back to his own room and met Godfrey there.
"Take this to Frizinghall,"
Franklin said to Godfrey.
"It's not safe here. I'm too tired to move. Take it at once."
In the morning, Godfrey realized that Franklin didn't remember anything about the night before. From Rachel's behavior, Godfrey saw that Rachel knew Franklin had taken her diamond. Godfrey left for London with the moonstone as soon as possible and went straight to Mr. Luca. Mr. Luca examined the jewel carefully.
"How did you come by this?"
he asked Godfrey.
"And I only want to hear the truth. I cannot help you if you do not tell me the truth."
Godfrey needed to borrow money, and he told Mr. Luca that Franklin had given him the jewel. Mr. Luca then agreed to lend him £2,000 and to keep the diamond for a year. A few weeks before the day that Godfrey had to pay back his debt to Mr. Luca, he went abroad to Amsterdam. There he arranged to have the diamond cut up into smaller stones. If he sold the stones, he could make more than £20,000, enough to pay his client on his 21st birthday. Godfrey's plan was going very well, but he had forgotten one thing: the Indian priests. The priests had already lost 2 chances to recover their diamond. They had waited a long time for this 3rd chance, and they did not fail again. They finally got the diamond and took it home. And so the Indian guard was right when he had warned John Herncastle about the revenge of the moonstone. The diamond had nearly destroyed his family. But Franklin and Rachel were strong and determined. They had solved the mystery, and soon after Franklin's innocence was proved, he and Rachel were engaged. The wedding ceremony took place at the house in Yorkshire on the 9th of October 1849, and old Gabriel Betteridge was the happiest servant in England. And where was the Moonstone now? 6 months later, Mr. Bruff received a letter from Mr. Mirthwaite.
February 1850. Dear Mr. Bruff, since we last spoke after dinner in the autumn of 1848, I have been travelling in Asia. In our conversation, we spoke about the Moonstone. I am writing to you now with news of that jewel. I was travelling towards the city of Somnorth in southern India. On the way, I met many people who were travelling to the same place. They were Hindu pilgrims on their way to a special ceremony at Somnorth. I disguised myself as a Hindu and joined the pilgrims in order to witness the ceremony. On the night of the full moon, I went with hundreds of pilgrims to a hill outside the city. On top of the hill, there was a big flat rock, and on the rock was a small shrine covered with some cloth. The ceremony began, and 3 Hindu priests came onto the rock. I recognized them immediately. They were the same Indians that we saw in the garden of the Verinder's house in Yorkshire on the evening of Miss Rachel's birthday party. The men knelt down in front of the shrine and took off the cloth. There, in front of us, was the statue of the moon god, and in the forehead of the statue was the yellow diamond, the same one that Miss Rachel had worn on her dress. After 3 long centuries, the Moonstone adventure is over. The jewel is back in the place where it belongs, and it will never be seen in England again.